If you hike the Grand Canyon in 114 degrees heat, there is one obvious rule: bring water. So one hiker did exactly that. He drank more than 2 gallons. He kept drinking. He seemed to be doing everything right. And after doing exactly what the heat seemed to demand, he ended up in a rescue helicopter having a grand mal seizure in midair. The paradox here is terrifying. He wasn't a victim of dehydration. The very thing he was using to survive the heat was now threatening his brain. Doctors call it hyponatremia, but giving it a name doesn't explain how this is even possible. How does the water your body needs to survive extreme heat become dangerous simply because you kept drinking? He had plenty. And that is what makes this so easy to get wrong. The advice behind it begins with something completely true. In extreme heat, you sweat, lose enough fluid, and your blood volume falls, cardiovascular strain rises, and cooling gets harder. So for decades, sports medicine pushed hard against dehydration. By the 1990s, official exercise guidelines were telling athletes to drink early and regularly, enough to replace what they lost through sweat, or as much fluid as they could tolerate. The intention was sensible: don't fall behind. The trouble starts when a useful rule gets flattened into a one-way rule. If some water makes you safer, more water must make you safer still. You can see that logic everywhere now. Giant bottles marked by the hour, reminders telling you when to drink. Hydration turned into something you can complete. We took drinking water and turned it into a productivity metric. But your body does not keep score that way. Too little fluid is dangerous. Too much relative to what you're losing and excreting can push your blood chemistry in the opposite direction. So hydration is not a tank you fill to the top. It is a balance your body is constantly defending, which creates an obvious problem. If you really drink more water than you need, why don't your kidneys simply dump the excess? They are built to do exactly that. So what stops them? Hydration has two edges. The dangerous edge starts with something that sounds almost too simple. The sodium number doctors measure is a concentration. It tells you how much sodium is present relative to the amount of water around it. It is not a count of how much total salt is left in your body. So if water begins accumulating faster than you can get rid of, that concentration falls. You do not have to somehow sweat out every last bit of sodium. Add enough water to the system and the ratio changes. That is why the common explanation, you sweat out salt, then replace it with plain water, is only part of the story. Salt loss can contribute, but in many of the severe exercise-associated cases researchers worry about most, the bigger problem is positive water balance, more fluid coming in than going out. The Boston Marathon made that visible. Researchers tested 488 runners at the finish line. 13% had hyponatremia, 3 were critically low. And hyponatremia was strongly associated with gaining weight during the race. Think about what that means. Some people ran 26.2 miles and crossed the finish line heavier than when they started. They had not simply failed to replace water. Water had accumulated. More changes the balance, but that still leaves the question from a moment ago. If extra water is the problem, why do your kidneys not just get rid of it? Normally, they can. Your kidneys can produce very dilute urine when water intake rises, but how much water they release is heavily influenced by a hormone called arginine vasopressin, or AVP. One of AVP's jobs is to conserve water. When AVP is elevated, the kidneys hold on to more water and excrete less of it. That is useful when your body actually needs to conserve fluid. And normally, if your blood becomes too dilute, AVP should shut down. The kidneys can then let more water leave. But in some people who develop exercise-associated hyponatremia, AVP does not shut down the way you would expect. Prolonged hard exercise can generate non-osmotic signals that keep AVP elevated even while the blood is becoming too dilute. Pain, nausea, physical stress, and heat can all add to that signal. So picture a bathtub. Drinking is the faucet. Your kidneys are the drain. AVP is the valve controlling how open that drain is. Now, keep the faucet running while the drain is partly closed. That is the trap. The problem is no longer just how much you drank. It's how much came in compared with how much your body could clear. The drain falls behind. And this is where the word kill in the title becomes literal. As the sodium concentration in the blood falls, the fluid outside your cells becomes more dilute. Water begins moving into the cells. They swell. Most tissues have at least some room to accommodate that swelling. Your brain does not. It sits inside a rigid skull. If brain cells swell rapidly enough, pressure rises and normal brain function begins to fail. Severe acute hyponatremia can progress from confusion to seizures, a coma, brain herniation, and death. That is how drinking too much water can kill you. The brain has nowhere. But before that turns into the wrong lesson, there is an important correction. This is not a reason to ration water in extreme heat. Dehydration is still a major contributor to heat illness, and drinking during exertion matters. Severe symptomatic exercise-associated hyponatremia is uncommon. The danger here is sustained overdrinking relative to what you are losing and clearing. And that distinction matters because out in the real world, the two problems can look disturbingly similar. Imagine someone after hours of hiking in the heat. They have a headache, they feel nauseous and weak. Maybe they start vomiting or seem unusually sluggish. The obvious thought is dehydration, so someone hands them another bottle. And if they are dehydrated, fluids may be exactly what they need. But early exercise-associated hyponatremia can produce many of those same symptoms. If that person has already been drinking beyond what they are losing and clearing, blindly forcing more fluid can push the imbalance further. Then the picture can change quickly. Confusion, a seizure, collapse. At that point, this is not a hydration guessing game. Heat stroke and severe hyponatremia are both medical emergencies. The practical lesson is not to diagnose one from a YouTube video. It is to stop assuming that every person who becomes sick in the heat automatically needs another bottle forced into them. If emergency responders are involved, how long the person was exerting and roughly how much they drank can matter. That is the cruel part of this paradox. The first warning signs can look like a request for more of the thing making the problem worse. Now the symptoms lie. Which brings us to the obvious backup plan. Fine, drink electrolytes. Electrolytes can matter during prolonged sweating, but a sports drink does not make excess fluid disappear. Sodium can soften the drop in blood sodium, but it cannot reliably prevent hyponatremia if the total amount of fluid still exceeds what the body is losing and clearing. There's a grim example from high school football. In 2014, a player reportedly drank about 4 gallons of water and sports drinks during practice while trying to relieve muscle cramps. He died from hyponatremic encephalopathy. Even official workplace heat guidance recognizes an upper guardrail. NIOSH says fluid intake generally should not exceed about 48 ounces per hour. That's not a universal danger line. It's a reminder that hydration has an upper boundary too. Changing what's in the bottle does not make unlimited bottles safe. Electrolytes don't erase volume. That overdrinking pathway is real, but it is not the only road to low sodium in the heat. In one small study, researchers followed 44 male dockyard workers in the Middle East through summer and winter. By summer's end, 55% were hyponatremic, compared with 8% in winter. Their situation was different. Long hours of manual labor in the heat, heavy sweat losses, and a low-sodium diet and fluids. The end point was similar, but the road there was different. And that matters because the hotter the environment gets, the harder it becomes to reduce hydration to one simple rule. Now zoom out. In 2024, researchers pulled together data covering roughly 650,000 patients around the world. Across those studies, hotter outdoor temperatures were repeatedly associated with abnormal blood sodium, usually lower sodium. But most of those studies also had a high risk of bias, so this does not prove that heat itself causes hyponatremia. It points to something more useful. A hotter world makes simplistic hydration advice harder, not easier. CDC tells older adults in hot weather not to wait for thirst. Its travel guidance for prolonged exercise warns that forcing fluids when you are not thirsty can raise the risk of hyponatremia. Those instructions sound contradictory. They aren't. The person changed, the exposure changed, so the guardrail changed. Human fluid balance doesn't fit on a motivational water bottle. Survival isn't one way. Go back to the Grand Canyon and 114 degrees heat. There is still one obvious rule: bring water. That rule never became wrong. The mistake was treating it as if it had no upper edge.
For prolonged recreational exercise, don't force yourself to keep drinking just to hit a target. Thirst can be one guardrail against overdrinking, but it is not a universal prescription for every person or every heat exposure. The hiker was prepared for the danger everyone could see: too little water. What nearly killed him was crossing the other side of the same balance. That is the larger rule. Survival is not about maximizing what keeps you alive. It is knowing when enough becomes too much.